For me, I think injustice is more than a concept. My family, were Hmong, ethnically we're Hmong. We came from the country of Laos to the United States in 1979. And we came as refugees. So my family experienced almost kind of like a dual injustice. One was we were ousted out of their home country or our home country, and that was another level of disenfranchisement and having to reinvent yourself when you move to a completely different country, a completely different worldview. So I think that was the kind of the first level of injustice that our family had experienced, and then coming here to the U.S., although it was a great opportunity for our family to start fresh, I think there were some things that were stacked against us as immigrants, refugees, things that really you can't fault the system for, but within that, the imperfections of the systems that oftentimes held us back more than propelled us forward. I think for us, that was a big eye-opener, that we weren't just in the land of promise and the American dream, but it was also a land of struggle. The war was a very confusing thing, and so when our family arrived, the narrative that they received was, hey, you have all the opportunity in the world, become an American citizen, pursue the American dream. You can have the Asian dream. You're trying to become a doctor, a lawyer, and an engineer, having both the Asian American dream. And my parents achieved it, and they did. They really did. Hardworking. They were always blue collar, but hardworking. And so, in the 90s, Bill Clinton released some documents about the war in Laos that actually verified that the U.S. Was engaged in Laos, and it was then disclosed that Laos was the most bombed and shelled country in all of history. And we knew this back in, or at least people knew that the war was confusing. The war in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, that was very confusing. When the Hmong people in the U.S. began to understand more the vague reasons for why the war happened, and how the idea of democracy was kind of one of the primary reasons why, and but there was probably some socioeconomic reasons and just global influence reasons why the U.S. was intervening. A lot of the Hmong people who came here and who sold the American dream felt very betrayed. It's easy for my generation to be like, oh, all those Americans, they sold us a bill of goods or whatever, and honestly, that there is a place in my heart that oftentimes I can feel that way. But Jesus helps to, knowing Jesus and knowing the story of the Bible, and knowing that this whole narrative is still unraveling, is redeeming a lot of that. I tell people that it doesn't make the pain go away. It doesn't make everything right. But the power of actually knowing that God is in control, number one, and number two, that it is intrinsic to His nature to take the greatest atrocities and to transform them for the greatest good, to know that that's intrinsic to His nature, it keeps me from jumping off the deep end and just saying, oh, America sucks. And I don't believe America sucks, but some people say that. But it also keeps me in this tension where I need to hold my home country, America, accountable for the things and the injustices that it perpetuated onto entire nations. And so that tension is a healthy one, because that now puts me as a Christian first in a prophetic community where where we need to be. We need to be prophetic people. And when your primary identity is nation and your primary identity is land, it gets very confusing. But when your primary identity is God and the narrative of the Bible, that allows you to be prophetic. And I'm learning how to do that more and more. It's somewhat dangerous is when there's a strong preference for a particular race or a particular racial mentality that begins to either be oppressive or it begins to reduce opportunities from those who are outside of that race. This is where it's difficult, because you live and breathe who you are, and so you're unaware of your own biases. And so sometimes we're unaware that our personal preferences, the things that we're so used to, even in our casual practice of those things, they actually exacerbate other people's situations to the point where it reduces their opportunity, it reduces their ability to advance, and it reduces their voice. And so when our racial biases kind of shield us or blind us from those kinds of injustices, that's when it gets a little bit dangerous. And I think that's where a lot of the things that we see that cause tension begin to happen. The old conversations around race, they're starting to change a little bit. And so, for instance, we're learning more about race and the social construction of race. We're also learning more about anthropology and sociology. The categories that we used to use before apply less today. That's not because we don't live in a less racial society. It just means that the conversation is changing. It's actually becoming more complex. It's becoming more nuanced. There are people who actually identify as multiracial, multi-ethnic. So that really creates a nuance in the conversation of racial diversity, and that's why it's important for young people to get involved, because you will own the language 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Census says that by 2042 or so, the United States will, for the first time, be a minority majority, meaning that whites will be less than 50% for the first time. Asians are the fastest growing group. Latinos are now the new largest minority. All these shifts are nuancing the conversation even more. The language is going to change. For instance, like back in the 50s, we used to talk about, when it came to churches, we would talk about how churches need to integrate. So you would have something called the integrated church, where black and whites went to church together. A few years later, a couple of decades later, through immigration, the conversation around race became a little bit more complex. So instead of talking about integrated churches, back in the 90s, we started talking about multi-ethnic churches, because we were now accounting for immigrants. So you can see how the language, the conversation is progressing. It's going to become different. The categories in which we talk about these things are going to become different. The Bible gives us a transcendent way to think about these categories. The way that we talk about it today is very generationally locked, conditioned by our sociology, our anthropology. The Bible gives us an eternal language to talk about diversity and unity in the midst of diversity, because it really does paint the world as God's children, God's unique group of image bearers, that each one in each group uniquely reflects an aspect about himself. And I think if we divorce race and ethnicity from that picture, that we actually have a diversity of ways to reflect who God is in this world, then we've undercomplicated the conversation. I think we need to overcomplicate the conversation. And ultimately, the Bible tells us that it's because we were made to reflect the diversity that exists within God that He meant to manifest in the world. We should be setting the trend for a lot of these conversations, because in some ways, the why question we already know. It's the how that we need to work with society. Right? We need to work on how do we implement God's justice, how do we implement diversity. But we know why. It's because God loves diversity. It's His heart. He's diverse within Himself. And that's why He created a diverse world. So we need to lead the conversation, I think. If you read the book of Acts and you learn anything about the early church, one of the churches, or one of the first churches that you read about in the Bible, is in a city called Antioch. And Antioch is a very metropolitan city, comparatively, very diverse. As a matter of fact, it was a place where the Roman government had a military installation, and so it was a place where commercial trading took place. And it was interesting because when the people in Antioch became followers of Jesus, and from different backgrounds, Africans, Jews, Greeks, they became followers of Jesus. For some of them, a very foreign concept to follow after a man who claimed to be God. And for whatever reason, I think I know what it was, but for whatever reason, it shifted how they thought about themselves. It replaced their primary identity at that time, which might have been a merchant, it might have been an African person, and it shifted that identity to becoming a child of God through following the Messiah Jesus. And so it displaced but replaced their identity, or I should say it actually refined their identity. And so this happened all over through Antioch, and this was kind of a little kind of a chaotic movement that was happening in the city. And it began to actually become a controversial thing, because for the first time in the city you see Africans and Jews and Greeks coming together, who otherwise they wouldn't have anything in common, and they began to live together and share things together and worship together and follow this man named Jesus. And it's interesting because the Bible says that it was there the first time that they were called Christians. And so you think about how the church engaged in just being a multi-ethnic, multicultural community, and they were named little Jesuses or little Christ because they had followed his example and brought peace and harmony among all these disparate people groups. So we have a strong precedent in the founding of our faith, the founding of the church. And so we're not coming to a new conversation. We're just living in the story that was started for us 2,000 years ago. What I do think those who follow Jesus can help in nuancing this conversation around privilege is this, and it's following Jesus' example really, is whenever I'm in a place in which I have a slight advantage or I have a greater opportunity, how can I use that to leverage those who are immediately around me? You know, I'm not as worried about someone who's across the country. I'm not worried as much as somebody who's around the world. But for those that I know and those who are, in my sphere of influence, maybe the 150 people or so that you know, how can I help leverage them? And I think that conversation becomes more localized, it becomes more personalized, it becomes more meaningful to you when you're having the conversation. And it's not this broad, kind of like high-level esoteric conversation that we're having. It becomes more about how do you individually leverage the gifts and talents God's given to you to release the next person into their destiny that God has planned for them. Practically overcoming things like racial bias. Again, it's hard to tell. I mean, how do you know what you don't know, right? I mean, it's a bias, so bias almost implies blind spots sometimes. But how do you overcome those things? And a part of overcoming them is ample time with people that are different from you. And not just like casual time, but like being immersed in environments where you're uncomfortable and you have to learn something and you have to give up a certain precedent or preference in order to integrate into that community. But I think the reality is that in North America, in the city that we live in, that being in that integrated space is our only way to really have our blind spots pointed out, and for us to actually step outside of ourselves and be able to see those things. But at the end of the day, it really is about who comes in and out of your home. As long as we're reading about it and just tweeting about it and just Facebooking about it, it'll never move us into action. The moment when we know it affects the people that we love, that's when we move. And I'm really encouraged by this generation of young people because they really do want to love people that are different from them. There's a really cool passage in the Bible, and it was written by a guy named Paul. And Paul's actually describing Jesus. And you actually really don't have to believe in Jesus or the Bible to understand Paul's point. But if you're a Christian, this should actually really hit you hard, because he's explaining in Philippians chapter 2 that Jesus was equal to God. But in Jesus' mind, it never once crossed his mind that he should cling to the rights that God has. He was equal with God, but it never once crossed his mind that he should actually cling on to those rights. And Paul explains that he actually, because of that, he actually became the God-man who would lower himself, not just to become a man or a human being, but to the form of a slave or a servant. Now it's interesting because Paul explains the reason why he did that was because he had to lower himself to a servant so that he could actually serve humanity. And so here's the picture of somebody who was the equivalent to God. He didn't cling to those rights in order so that he would give his life as a servant to many people. Why though? Why would that be the basis for the Christian faith? Paul later explains that the reason why the Christian God or the Christian understanding of God would do that is because in order to elevate those who are at the bottom, you have to get to the bottom too. And the Bible explains that when Jesus did that, he actually raised everybody who... So if you consider yourself at the bottom, spiritually, emotionally, economically, physically, if you're at the bottom of the bottom, if you're scraping the bottom of the barrel, that Jesus came for you, and by becoming a servant, he actually came to give you life and to raise you, not just to become a good human being, right? Because for some of us, I'm cool if I'm a good human being, I love other people, I'm kind. No, the Bible does this really weird thing where it says, no, you actually exceed that, and you become a child of God, and you become what Paul says, a co-heir. You inherit everything that Jesus inherits when he was with God the Father from the beginning of the world. And so you see God descending, humility, serving, so that he can actually serve those who are down here and to exalt them into his position where he first started.